Morning light cuts across the harbor of Monaco, and a white ocean liner called the Constitution eases in toward the dock. On her upper deck, 26-year-old Grace Kelly stands at the rail, with one hand resting on polished wood, a dress the color of cloud drifting around her shoulders. Behind her, in the steerage and the salons, sit 26 years of her professional life already packed into sea trunks. Below her, behind roped lines, a forest of 600 lenses waits. 600 cameras, 600 chances for the world to capture one final photograph before Hollywood's most discreet leading lady disappears. 13 months earlier, she had held an Academy Award in her hands. Now a principality is about to receive her, and it is impossible, at this hour, to say which transaction is the larger one. The press wants a fairy tale. The photographers want a pose. The liner's horn sounds across the water, and somewhere a Catholic girl from Philadelphia tightens her grip on the rail the way she has tightened her grip on 1,000 small moments before. A reflex she learned so long ago, she no longer remembers when she learned it. The suit she is wearing, even on a transatlantic crossing, is designed exactly to the way she believes this morning should look. Her face is set in that famous, unreadable stillness. She does not smile for the cameras yet. She is waiting for the correct moment to smile. The moment when the choreography of being received will permit a smile. And almost no one watching her from the dock realizes, on this bright morning in April of 1956, that what they are seeing is the last free minute of her public life. Not in the sense of imprisonment, in the sense of ownership. From this morning forward, every gesture she makes belongs to a country instead of to her. On the dock, in a gray suit, Prince Rainier III of Monaco waits at 32. He is the sovereign ruler of a piece of coastline smaller than New York's Central Park, a place that survives, in part, on the revenues of a gambling casino and, in another part, on a tax arrangement with France that allows foreign money to rest undisturbed within its borders. The world sees a bridegroom. He knows, at the back of his mind, that what he is greeting is the most efficient single piece of public relations his kingdom has ever been offered. They shake hands. The greeting is brief, polite, and warmer than the public part of the handshake fully allows. A man who barely knows a woman greets a woman who has barely known a man, and both have been coached by advisors to behave as though they have known each other longer than a few months and across greater emotional ground than their letters ever crossed. The press writes the word love with no hesitation in every headline by evening. Nobody, in any of those headlines, writes the word account. Yet behind every photograph of this greeting, behind every ribboned stone and every folded napkin and every uniform being prepared in the cathedral, account is exactly the word that ought to be present. Account is the word that explains why a tiny Mediterranean principality, in need of heirs and attention, has flown its most eligible bachelor across an ocean to sit next to a film star at a photographer's table, then courted her through months of carefully engineered letters, and is now welcoming her as the bride of the year, with the full expectation that the cameras will do the rest of the work the country cannot do for itself. Account is the word that explains why a devout Catholic from Philadelphia, already at the age when Hollywood begins quietly forgetting actresses who refuse its terms, has accepted a man, a country, a religion of state, and a future in which she will never again stand on a soundstage and say, action. Account is the word that will go unspoken the morning she dies, 26 years later, on a mountain road above a harbor not so different from this one. So here's the question this hour-long journey proposes, the question that walked her down the gangway of the Constitution and into the rest of her life. Did Grace Kelly enter a marriage, or did she enter a prison sentence with very good lighting? It is a question no working historian has ever been able to answer with certainty, in part because the woman who could have answered it best left almost no record of what she believed about any of it. What the world saw instead was a surface so disciplined that even the people closest to her sometimes forgot, between long stretches of polite distance, that there was a woman being held under it. The most photographed bride of the 20th century did not exchange a director's chair for a throne. She exchanged a director's chair for a nation's expectations, and discovered, gradually and at great cost, the difference between the two, only after the cameras of the wedding had been packed away and the cameras of the everyday had taken their place. There is a strange arithmetic to her life that biographers keep returning to, and it begins on this gangway. A woman whose stillness on screen had launched 1,000 magazine covers discovered, on this morning, that the stillness she had always used as armor could also become a wall, and that a wall can be just as useful to the people on the other side of it as to the woman behind it. Every newsreel company in the world wanted a frame of her stepping off the gangway. The palace wanted a frame of her stepping onto its land. Her father, Jack Kelly, wanted a frame of her stepping into an empire more permanent than any studio contract. And the young woman herself, 26, fluent in 3 languages only by accident, trained for 10 years to deliver exactly what a camera required, prepared to give the world what it had come for, in the only language she had ever been allowed to perfect. The story everyone wanted was a story of a Hollywood star walking up the steps of a real palace in a dress that cost more than the average American house. The story that was actually happening, beneath the flashbulbs, was a contract. Multiple contracts, in fact. One signed before she stepped on the ship, between her father and the principality, in the form of a dowry so substantial it has been described by later biographers, with some justice, as a purchase price. One signed between her studio, MGM, and the palace, in which her remaining pictures were bought back from the studio in exchange for the studio being granted the distribution rights to the official documentary of the wedding itself. One signed, finally, inside the young woman herself, in which she agreed, perhaps for love, perhaps for exhaustion, perhaps for the plain relief of having a decision forced upon her, to take her place in a country that needed her image more than it needed her happiness, and to hold that place for the rest of her life. None of these documents will ever be read in full by any outsider. They are still, almost 7 decades later, kept under conditions that scholars describe politely as not fully open. From the outside, they look like fairy tale clauses. From the inside, every biographer who has worked with the palace's oral tradition has come away with the same uncomfortable impression, that the marriage was arranged, scheduled, and signed in detail before a single vow was spoken in any cathedral, in any language, by either of the 2 people whose names would appear on the certificate. And so this is the true picture of what Grace Kelly walked into on the morning of April 19, 1956. A small country, in need of publicity and of an heir, opening its harbor for her. A studio, in need of one last narrative for its brightest contract player, opening its vaults for her. A father, in need of a daughter married well, opening his accounts for her. And a prince, in need of a wife his kingdom could be proud of, in newspapers from New York to Tokyo, opening his arms for her and finding, in them, the same young woman the cameras had been photographing for years, composed, contained, and almost certainly keeping something to herself that nobody would ever ask her to explain. The answer to the question this investigation asks, what she actually walked into, turns out in the end to be stranger than the fairy tale the world wanted in 1956, and stranger than the tragedy the world accepted in 1982, when the same harbor that had welcomed her also, in a different season, carried her away. Before any of it, before the harbor, before the dress, before the cameras, before the contract that nobody was permitted to read, there was a brick house on Henry Avenue in Philadelphia, and inside it a girl who learned, very early, that being still was safer than being noticed. Grace Patricia Kelly was born in 1929 into an Irish-American family whose name, by the time she arrived, already carried weight in that city. Her father, Jack Kelly, was not a man who measured love in anything softer than accomplishment. He had taken a bricklaying business and built it into a fortune, had rowed his way to 3 Olympic gold medals in a previous life, and at one point, with the same confident stride, had run for mayor of Philadelphia on the strength of the household name. His view of the family, as reported by those who knew him and by biographers who later studied him, was simply drawn. Sons were to be athletes, sharp and competitive, expected to carry medals home from regattas the way other boys carried home report cards. Daughters were to be raised into a particular kind of marriage, the kind that lifted the family another rung up the ladder of the Philadelphia Irish. Grace, arriving last in a house already full of older brothers and a vigorous older sister, slid into a household that had been running, efficiently, without her. The boy on the next floor had a name waiting on a trophy. The girl a year ahead of her had a name waiting on a debutante list. The third Kelly child learned, in a way that no one in the family was aware of teaching her, that in a house where love was measured by what you had won that day, the safest place for a quiet girl was the edge of the room. There is a story about her childhood that biographers repeat, and it is told with care because it is one of the few concrete things she ever said on the record about her early years. As a small child, she had a stutter. The household around her was already a place in which the loudest voice in any room tended to be the one most rewarded, and a child who could not get the words out cleanly learned, fast, to keep her words for later. She played piano recitals at school. She took small parts in school plays. Jack Kelly noted these contributions the way he noted the weather, with a glance and a nod, not with the approval she was hungry for, and the family moved on. She learned something in those years that she would never unlearn. In a room full of people who loved her, a girl could still remain essentially unseen. That lesson traveled with her, intact, when she left that brick house for acting classes in New York and then for a film studio in California. It traveled with her through her first walk-on parts in the early 1950s, and on through the small, well-controlled roles she was allowed to develop inside the studio system. It even traveled with her across the Atlantic, when the only journey left worth taking was one back to Europe, to marry a man she had met a single time. The stillness that the camera loved on her, the stillness that would later be described by critics as a kind of wonder, was not a discovery of the screen. It was already there, 3 decades old by the time the studios got around to noticing it. By 1954, she had won an Academy Award for her work in a country drama, and directors had begun to circle her with the sort of attention usually reserved for women whose fame has passed beyond their control. Alfred Hitchcock, in particular, cast her 3 times in 4 years, building parts around her the way a tailor builds a suit around a frame he has measured twice. In interviews decades later, Hitchcock would describe her on-screen manner in language that other directors would borrow from him for the rest of her career. He called her the greatest chess player among them all, meaning that her control of a scene did not look like withdrawal. It looked like a player moving pieces into place 3 moves ahead of the audience. Audiences felt it too, even when they could not name it. Her characters on screen, the elegant socialite married to a man of doubtful loyalty, the refined spy exchanging cool glances with Cary Grant, the mysterious heiress pursued by a politically flexible suitor, always seemed to know something about themselves that the men around them did not. That quality came from the same place as the stillness. It came from a Philadelphia house in which an entire childhood had taught her that no unguarded expression of feeling ever won her the thing she most needed. The surface she wore on screen was the same surface she had worn at home. What changed was only the audience. By 25, she had learned the lesson Hollywood tries to teach most of its leading women, that the discipline of doing the work quietly, of asking precise questions, of never raising her voice even after 12 takes of the same shot, was a marketable skill and a survival skill at the same time. Many directors later used the same words about her, as if they had all, separately, decided on the same honest description. She did the hard work as if it were nothing. That sentence contains the whole of her childhood, and the whole of her career up to the moment of the Cannes meeting, and the whole of the marriage that followed. Jack Kelly, the bricklayer's son who had wanted his daughter to marry well, never quite forgave her for choosing acting in the first place. After the Oscar, after the world placed her at its summit, he was reported to have told a journalist that his pride in the family was his son, not his actress daughter. Grace carried that verdict quietly, the way she carried every verdict she ever received from a father whose love was conditional on outcomes. The verdict followed her into Monaco. It sat beside her at every state dinner she would one day attend, the small, unhealed verdict of a girl who had done everything her father could have asked and received in return the family's silence. In the spring of 1955, she crossed the Atlantic in the ordinary course of her work, attending the Cannes Film Festival. A magazine, looking for a single arresting photograph, arranged for her to be introduced to Prince Rainier III of Monaco, 31 and unmarried, sovereign of a country of roughly 40,000 people whose identity depended entirely on how the world regarded what happened inside its borders. The two met for a photograph. At the time, neither of them thought of the meeting as anything beyond a photograph. That is what they both said later, and they were both, in their own ways, telling the truth. What neither of them understood in that brief encounter was the gravitational pull that had brought them into the same frame in the first place. Rainier had lived every morning of his adult life inside an arrangement signed in 1918 between Monaco and France. If the Grimaldi line ever failed to produce an heir, the principality would fall under French administrative control. He had spent years searching for a bride who could satisfy 2 opposing forces at the same time: the Catholic aristocracy of Europe, with its quiet insistence on lineage, and a small country whose economy depended on the rest of the world continuing to look at it with attention. Both of those requirements, he had come to realize, could be solved by a single solution: a Hollywood star, nominally devout, with a face that the entire world already looked at. Grace Kelly solved both problems at once, and his advisors recognized it before he did. The letters the two exchanged after Cannes have been studied in the years since by biographers with different sympathies, and the portraits they give of those letters overlap less than their authors would like. Some biographers describe the correspondence almost as a draft treaty between two skilled parties setting the terms of a joint venture. Dignified, careful, precise about everything that mattered, vague about very little except the interior emotional lives of the two writers. Robert Lacey, drawing on interviews inside both the Kelly and Grimaldi circles in his 1994 study of the marriage, leans in this direction. He argues that whatever affection developed between them grew from a foundation of mutual respect, and that the practical arrangements were already in place before the passion had any chance to catch up. A decade later, Jeffrey Robinson, working with Palace Circle contacts, pushes back hard against that reading. Robinson insists that Rainier felt an immediate and genuine love for her, and that the calculations behind the courtship never displaced the feeling. Both versions cannot be fully true at the same time. What can be said with confidence is that by the spring of 1955, a young woman stood at an unstable point in her life. She had the Oscar. She had 3 Hitchcock pictures. In Hollywood circles it was whispered, gently but with authority, that she was 25 and approaching the ceiling of the roles the studio system could keep building for her. What came next, in the industry's quiet arithmetic, would require either a miraculous reinvention of her image or a graceful exit from it. A prince offered her that exit, and offered it in a frame that made it sound less like a retirement than like a coronation. Friends from that era, who saw her in the months around Cannes, remember a woman who spoke of Rainier with affection and at the same time with great caution, the voice of someone describing a decision that had already been made and was not open for further discussion. Whatever she thought privately, she wrote almost nowhere. The absence of those documents has itself become a piece of evidence in a debate that is not closed since. The same silence she had learned in her father's house on Henry Avenue made her the world's most photographed bride, and made her simultaneously the one person in the room who could not be interviewed about the decisions she had made. In January of 1956, a small notice appeared in the European and American press. The engagement of Her Serene Highness the Princess of Monaco was not yet at issue. What was announced was the engagement of an American film actress to a sovereign prince, and the framing across most of those wire stories was the framing that the world would carry with it for the rest of her public life. The story, on its surface, was a happy one. A star of the screen was to marry a prince. The arrangements behind that announcement have been studied in different decades, with different sympathies and from different archival positions. And what becomes clear from those studies is that the marriage was not organized by the 2 people whose names were attached to it. It was organized by 3 institutions operating simultaneously, each one with its own particular interest, each one producing a document or a clause that would shape the rest of her life. The first institution was the Principality of Monaco, and the document it produced was, in its essentials, a contract whose terms no outsider has been fully permitted to read even now. Under that contract, as later biographers have reconstructed it from fragments and oral tradition, her father was required to provide a substantial dowry to Monaco. Publicly, the money was described as a wedding gift from a prosperous American family to a small sovereign state. Inside the Academy, and inside the more candid palace biographies, the gift has been described in much starker language, with some writers calling it close to a purchase price for the arrangement, and others pointing out that the Principality's continuity itself, in the arithmetic of the 1918 treaty with France, was the true commodity being exchanged. The second institution was MGM Studios, which still had years left on the acting contract it had signed with her when she first climbed the studio's ladder. The studio, in turn, negotiated its own contract, separate from the palace's, and the terms of that contract have been documented in greater detail because they were attached to a public, civilian transaction. MGM received the distribution rights to the official documentary about the wedding itself. In exchange, the studio released her from her remaining pictures, including several projects on which she had been attached or openly announced. The studio was compensated, in narrative terms, with the worldwide broadcast of its brightest contract player being transformed into a princess. The princess, in exchange, was being paid for, in the most literal financial sense, by her father and by her own studio, before she had walked up a single step of a single staircase in her new country. Imagine, in the strangeness of that early spring, a young woman moving between dress fittings she had not chosen, press conferences she had not requested, and family negotiations she could not shape, for a marriage that had been turned into a corporate transaction by 3 different institutions before she had ever stepped to the altar. Somewhere inside that machinery she had to find, for herself, a private space in which to feel whatever she actually felt about the man she was about to marry. No one made that space for her. As she had always quietly built every private space she had ever needed, she built this one herself, telling no one what was happening inside it. The wedding itself lasted 2 days in April of 1956. The first day was a quiet civil registration, with a small group of witnesses and a few tight smiles. The second day was the religious ceremony inside St. Nicholas Cathedral in Monaco, and on that day there were 600 guests in the pews. Outside the cathedral, where there were no seats left to fill, the rest of the world stood. The exact figure that circulated through the wires at the time was 30 million television viewers across the day, a record that no single event in the still short history of broadcast television had matched. The dress she wore has been written about more than most acts of 20th century theater, and the numbers behind it tell their own story. 25 yards of silk, 100 yards of tulle and lace, a piece of lace that had been lifted, deliberately, from one of her own film costumes, so that the woman the cameras had known in black and white would, in some quiet stitch, walk into her wedding. The dress was sewn by a small team of dressmakers in weeks of secret work. Rumor, never fully confirmed, places multiple fittings, multiple stand-ins, multiple uninterrupted nights of needlework in a studio closed to outsiders. The image that the public received of the dress and of the bride has gone down as the cleanest of the 20th century, and that very cleanliness is part of the story. Reporters without room inside the cathedral filed from the harbor, from the boats, from the rooftops of neighboring buildings, even from the vantage of small boats bobbing in the Mediterranean below. The spectacle was so vast that it swallowed the two people at its center. They became, in effect, two figures at the heart of a much larger image, an image that the principality had every interest in keeping legible, and the studio had every interest in selling, and the press had every interest in printing. Inside that swallowing, somewhere, sits the first true image of what later biographers would call the gilded cage. It is not a metaphor that historians invented for dramatic effect. It is a fact, recorded by people who stood close to her in those 2 days, and who noticed that the smile she wore had been scheduled the way a camera angle is scheduled. Grace Kelly, an actress who had spent a decade learning to stand in a precise spot, catch the light correctly, and deliver lines exactly as written, now spent the 2 most important days of her life playing a part written for her by a palace, a studio, and a nation. None of her own dialogue was permitted in the script. She smiled only where the plan required a smile. She tilted her head only where the cathedral's symmetry asked for it. Some staff who were present for the private fittings later reported, cautiously, that she had rehearsed parts of the ceremony in advance, working through her own cues much as she would have worked through her own cues for a Hitchcock picture, and that the woman in the dress and the actor behind the woman were, in those 2 days, indistinguishable. The wedding of the century was, in its real meaning, her greatest performance, and it was one that no one would ever let her exit after a director called cut. Watch those scenes now with that knowledge, and the discipline of her posture becomes almost unbearable to study. Her hands rested quietly in exactly the correct place. Her jaw tilted at exactly the angle the photograph needed. Her eyes, behind the veil, delivered the look that the world's image makers had spent the previous month deciding she should deliver. The 26-year-old woman trained to believe that love required a flawless performance gave, on those 2 days, the best performance of her life. The world read her professional perfection as pure joy, because the world had been taught, by her training, to read it that way. What nobody then knew, and what biographers have only been able to assemble slowly across decades, is how many of the decisions being celebrated on the broadcast that day had been made by people other than the bride. The bride's studio had finalized its terms. The bride's father had finalized his. The bride's future husband, through his counsel, had finalized his. The bride, by contrast, had finalized very little. The public story of that April said that a fairy tale had found its correct ending. The private story, kept inside palace files and inside an MGM archive that historians are still negotiating access to, is closer to a prospectus for a long-term joint venture, executed in good faith by every party and signed on the morning of the wedding itself by a young woman who had prepared her face for the camera the way she had prepared it for every camera in the previous decade, and who stepped down the long aisle of St. Nicholas Cathedral believing, as so many brides do in the first minutes of any marriage, that the contract she had signed with the public was the most important contract of her life. The first weeks in the palace revealed the strangeness slowly, the way a small pebble inside a shoe becomes a sore only after many miles of walking. Grace had arrived in a country of roughly 40,000 people, smaller than Central Park, where she did not yet speak the language properly, knew almost no one beyond her husband's small circle, and felt the building she had been given operate less like a house than like an institution carrying 200 years of protocol inside its walls. She had left behind her profession, her country, her mother tongue, and the public identity she had spent 10 years of hard craft constructing. In exchange, she had received a crown and a few rooms inside a rock palace overlooking the Mediterranean. Friends who saw her in those early years remember a woman embracing her new situation with great difficulty, sitting down with tutors for French while she was still navigating which fork to use at which course, and learning the court's elaborate ceremonies by running into them unexpectedly again and again. The gossip press on 2 continents waited for her to break with tradition. Her husband's family, which had publicly shown such warmth to an American actress who had taken a place many of their own daughters had hoped to occupy, did not always show that warmth behind closed doors. In letters her later biographers have studied, written to people who would have expected a princess to want for nothing, she confessed to missing ordinary things: walking without bodyguards, walking into a shop without an appointment, a friendship that did not have to flatter her rank in order to feel honest. Picture one ordinary Tuesday in her first year inside the palace. Staff woke her at the hour that tradition demanded, not at the hour her body asked for. A calendar that her assistants filled without consulting her held ribbon cuttings and chamber meetings. A translator sat beside her at gatherings, repeating language she was still learning, and translating in the same calm tone conversations that were being held about her own future. Between those ceremonial duties, a woman who had been paid to act for a decade now had to live, as performance, an entire life with no closing scene and no studio to walk away from. The cage built itself around her politely and slowly, one door at a time, each door reasonable on its own, every door together impossible to break. There is a particular sort of isolation that only the very visible can ever know. It is the isolation of a person who cannot entirely trust the deference of those around them, because every person inside the palace knows that their own position depends, however indirectly, on her position. Grace, who had grown up mostly unnoticed in her father's Philadelphia house, had moved into a state in which her unnoticedness was entirely visible to her. And that visibility pushed her, from the opposite direction, into the same quiet corner that she had occupied as a child. For most of her life, she had wanted to be noticed. Monaco gave her that, and corrupted the wish in the same gesture. Her husband, meanwhile, had always had to attend carefully to running a small state that survived on outward appearance. The 1918 treaty with France, the revenues from the casino, the ports that fed the principality's limited income, and the constant awareness that his private house was also, legally and operationally, a state office, all of these occupied him, even within his own rooms. He had married a woman who could draw the world's attention to Monaco, because that attention had always been the unspoken point of the marriage, and that same attention had become the strain at the center of it. Loving a wife and constructing an identity were 2 tasks he had been given at the same time, and the 2 never fully resolved themselves for him either. The first child, Caroline, was born in January of 1957, exactly 9 months after the wedding, and the contractual clause that had prompted the whole courtship quietly discharged itself the moment the child drew breath. An heir was now secure. Albert was born in March of 1958, a son, the direct male heir the diplomatic arithmetic had required, and with his birth, the immediate crisis that had driven Rainier to search for a bride finally ended. By the time the youngest child, Stephanie, was born in 1965, the household had shaped itself fully into its own geometry of corners and silences. Watch the chronology closely, because the chronology tells its own quiet story. Within 2 years of the wedding, the contractual requirements that had brought the bride and groom together had been met. The remaining 24 years of their married life took place after the contract had been fully discharged. That meant the thing that kept Grace and Rainier inside the same household for the next quarter century was something other than the calculation that had originally joined them. Neither of them ever named what that something was, not in any letter the biographers have located, not in any interview given to a friend. Whether it had become, by then, love or habit, or a particular form of mutual trust, or duty wearing the appearance of love, or some private mixture of all of these, that question has remained, across decades, unanswered. Inside a royal palace, motherhood operates by rules entirely different from those in most other houses. Grace learned those rules by running into them. A nanny, appointed by the palace and not freely chosen by the mother, ran the children's daily schedule. Detailed protocols dictated how many minutes a princess was permitted to spend with her own children in any given day, so as not to interfere with the ceremonial round of her public duties. Biographers decades later, drawing on interviews with household staff, describe a woman who quietly, persistently fought to spend ordinary time with her children beyond what her rank permitted. She insisted on cooking for them herself some evenings. She tried to put them to bed herself at hours staff considered theirs. None of these acts was dramatic. All of them were small rebellions inside a life that gave her very few large freedoms. Picture an evening in the early 1960s in a kitchen built for dozens of staff, the Princess of Monaco standing at the stove with a wooden spoon. She did not need to cook. The palace kitchen could have produced the meal without her involvement, with no one noticing. By every account of those who saw it, that act of cooking meant everything to her, because it was one of the very few things she did on her own initiative, not according to a schedule drawn up by assistants weeks in advance. The elder daughter, Caroline, had understood early, in the way small children sometimes do, that her mother had once been someone else. The girl had a face, the daughter realized, that the world had once celebrated on screens. The little girl in the palace was used to seeing her mother's face on framed magazine covers stored carefully in the palace library. Household staff remember the child pulling reels of old film from storage and watching her mother on screen the way a stranger would, searching for the version of the woman she knew at home and not quite locating it. By the end of her teens, Caroline had grown into the family's first public rebel, but the roots of that rebellion went earlier than 20. Back into a childhood spent watching her mother act calm for a public that never stopped looking. By the middle of the 1960s, the personal distance between Grace and Rainier had become, in the careful phrasing of multiple biographers working with different sources, not a temporary mood, but a permanent condition of their married life. Rainier bore the daily burden of a ruler by temperament as well as by birth, more interested in issuing instructions than in sharing interior weather. Grace, trained over a decade of film work into someone practiced at reading a room and doing what the room required, adapted herself to that tight setting, that language, those protocols, precisely, visibly, and at great cost. Nobody outside the palace walls was in any position to measure the cost. Rumors of Rainier's infidelity passed through Monaco's small aristocracy for years, and occasionally surfaced in European papers. No biographer, however, has produced documentary evidence of any specific affair, and many of those who have studied the marriage closely warn against taking the rumors at face value. Multiple sources agree that by the late 1960s, the marriage had come to resemble less a love affair than a well-run administrative alliance. Separate schedules, separate friends, shared devotion to the children and to the country. And in the words of those who knew them both, only occasional moments of private warmth in place of the long public affection the world still associated with their marriage. Grace kept a wide circle of friends outside Monaco and stayed in touch with old Hollywood colleagues for years. Officially, the palace had ended her acting career. Unofficially, in ways she kept to herself, she continued it. She did voice work for documentaries. She read poetry at small, carefully chosen events. Those poetry readings deserve attention, because they honestly indicate where she was looking for the part of her identity that the palace had no room for. The poems she chose, as friends later noted, appeared to hold some private resonance for her, but she never once explained what any of them meant. A princess reading poetry in a rented hall is, on the surface of her grand public life, only a footnote. Underneath that surface, in rooms smaller than any set she had ever acted on or any cathedral she had entered, she was quietly and patiently building, line by line, a self-expression that the palace could not write for her. She wanted to act again. That wish surfaced, again and again, in the accounts of those close to her in her final decade. And it surfaced with a particular ache. Monaco's constitution barred its princess from returning to the film industry, and Rainier, whatever feeling remained between them, enforced that rule without flexibility. In 1962, Alfred Hitchcock offered her the part of Marnie, and she accepted. The announcement produced an uproar inside Monaco. The idea that a princess would appear on screen again, in the established view of the palace, cheapened the very symbol that the marriage had been built to project. Within weeks, she withdrew from the project. She had given up one identity and moved into another, and discovered in that moment that the door back to the first one was locked from a side she could not reach. Sit with that moment for a moment, because it reveals more about their marriage than any argument or rumor could. To a woman whose single look could still an entire set, it was said, softly but firmly, that the woman she had been no longer existed. As she had accepted every revision since her days as an unnoticed, quiet child in her father's Philadelphia house, she accepted this one too. Self-control had always been her particular gift. Monaco gave that gift a permanent position. In the 1970s, her daughters began to inherit the same pressures, without the mother's careful management of them. Before Caroline married the French businessman Philippe Junot in 1978, her early adult life had been kept busy by a series of love affairs, followed eagerly by the press. The marriage the palace had at last been relieved to accept received widespread coverage. It collapsed inside 2 years, ending in a civil annulment that brought the family embarrassment. It was exactly the kind of disgrace Grace had spent 2 decades quietly trying to keep away from the family name. Watching her eldest daughter walk into a marriage she knew would not last, on the same path she had once walked in front of the same cameras, must have been a private weight for a woman who knew the price of those cameras better than anyone. Stephanie, a teenager in Grace's final years, had begun to show the restlessness that would define her public life. She openly defied the same rules her mother had spent 20 years quietly accepting. Where Grace had been composure, Stephanie became defiance. Biographers have called this contrast for a generation now a reversed inheritance. A mother taught from childhood to keep her feelings under glass, a daughter determined never to hide anything at all. Family friends, speaking without documentary evidence, say that Grace understood her younger daughter's rebellion better than she let on. A woman who had spent a lifetime inside a role she had not fully chosen may well have seen, in her daughter's refusal to play any role at all, a shade of envy she could never have spoken. By 1982, Grace Kelly was 52. She had been, twice over, one of the most recognized women on earth, first as a Hollywood actress, then as a princess. 26 years of marriage had made her a permanent photograph of herself, circulated on postcards in the very harbor where she had first arrived. Friends who saw her in that final year describe her considering options that she had never previously dared to think through seriously. Re-entering public events outside Monaco, spending longer periods abroad, quietly reshaping her life so that it ran around herself, and not exclusively around the small state her marriage had bound her to. Nothing was formally decided. Nothing was theatrically announced. By every account, she had begun to imagine her life with somewhat wider boundaries than the palace had ever permitted. It was not an escape, in the sense her faith would have allowed her to use. It was not a divorce, which her religion and her position made unthinkable. It was a small widening at the edges of a life otherwise reserved for the needs of others. The same quiet rebellion she had been staging in palace kitchens, in poetry halls, in abandoned film parts had perhaps, at 52, begun to gather into the opening of a second chapter. She was not given the chance to find out what shape that second chapter would have taken. Before the story turns toward its last day, it is worth pausing to notice what that small widening of imagination actually meant, 26 years on from the morning she had stood at the Constitution's rail. On the morning of September 13, 1982, Grace Kelly drove her Rover 3,500 along the Moyenne Corniche, the mountain road that connects her family's country house to the palace. Stephanie, then 17, sat in the passenger seat. The road descends through a mountainous section high above the Mediterranean in a series of tight curves, and the view from it is the same view that has made Monaco a postcard for 100 years. For reasons that no official investigation has ever been able to fully settle, the car left the descending lane and fell approximately 40 feet down a mountainside embankment. Grace suffered severe internal injuries and a cerebral hemorrhage. Stephanie survived with minor injuries. Grace Kelly died the following day at Monaco Hospital without regaining consciousness. The investigation into the accident produced an official report, but the questions that report raised have outlived it. The state of Monaco concluded that Grace had suffered a minor stroke at the wheel before the car left the road, and that medical conclusion was consistent with reports of minor health issues she had experienced in the weeks before the crash. Other possibilities have been advanced over the years, drawing on witness testimony and on inconsistencies in the accounts of the moments before the crash. Some commentators have suggested that Stephanie herself may have been driving at the moment the car went off the road, and that family members immediately constructed an official story intended to shield a 17-year-old girl from a lifetime of guilt and from a formal investigation. No biographer has confirmed this version with certainty, and the palace has never altered its early explanation. The only thing that can be said with confidence about that morning is that the road itself, the same stretch of coast that has made Monaco's postcards famous for a century, is the place where the woman who had maintained that image for 26 years met the end of her life. The spot itself carries an unbearable precision, and it is the tragic center of a small irony. A woman who had built her second life around the beauty of a particular landscape died on a section of that same landscape, the landscape that the cameras that had followed her since 1956 had most loved to photograph. The road on which she died remains one of the most photographed stretches of coastline in the world, and the same view for which she had performed 26 years of quiet acting is the view that outlived her, drawing crowds season after season, with no memory of her at all. She was buried 4 days later in the same St. Nicholas Cathedral in which she had married Rainier in 1956, and, as with the wedding, the funeral was broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. Both ends of her public life met inside the same building, before the same crowd of cameras, in the same principality that had so eagerly awaited her arrival, and that now documented her departure with equal attention. By every account of those who were near him that week, Rainier was genuinely devastated, and he did not remarry in the final 17 years of his life. Biographers of the marriage, who hold sharply different views of what that marriage actually was, agree on this one thing. For a sovereign prince to remain single for 17 years, against a privy council urging him daily to remarry, is not a small thing. Whatever the marriage had become in its last decade, Rainier's refusal to replace her suggests that he felt a loss deeper than the loss of an identity he had once needed. The country of Monaco, in the years since her death, has turned Grace Kelly back into the very symbol the marriage was originally constructed to produce. A small state that today, as in 1956, depends on the world's continuing interest in what happens inside its borders, she remains the permanent image of beauty and allure. In the harbor where she once disembarked, her face is sold on printed postcards. Tour guides describe her wedding inside the cathedral, and tourists now stand in the spot where 600 guests once sat. No traveler, looking at the postcard, asks the awkward question hidden behind the beautiful picture of her life. Did she really choose the life that wedding dress contained? Or did she, like everything else, perform it? She left with a silence the world mistook for peace. The question of what the marriage meant is not a question that has ever been settled. Robert Lacey, drawing on years of interviews inside both families, argues that Grace built a meaningful life inside the constraints the marriage imposed, raising 3 children, helping to shape modern Monaco, and finding satisfaction in a role that she carried out with skill and honesty. Jeffrey Robinson, working a decade later with Palace Circle contacts of his own, offers a different but ultimately kinder view. Within the constraints of the marriage, Robinson insists, there was real love. The distance that close observers noted between them in later decades was less the distance of 2 unhappy people than the distance of 2 people who were by nature deeply private, and whose private ways of showing affection did not translate well into the public record. A third biographer, Wendy Lean, tilts the picture towards sadness, portraying a woman who spent the second half of her life mourning the first, who had given up the work she loved and taken on a crown she could not put down, and who lived the remainder of her years inside the same stillness that had once been her private armor. None of these 3 has produced the single piece of evidence that would close the debate. Grace Kelly, raised from childhood not to show what she felt, left very little in her own words about what the marriage had cost her. And that silence is both the final quiet cruelty of the story and its final truth. A woman famous for an unrevealing face acted continuously for 26 years, and as a result, historians studying her through letters and interviews still cannot say today where the performance ended and the woman began. The gilded cage around her was built one piece at a time, a closed door, an abandoned film part, a suppressed ambition, a returned letter that should perhaps never have been written. Each piece looked reasonable on its own. Each piece was built by a contract, by a studio, by a palace, or by people who loved her too much to let her be ordinary. Picture, in closing, the quiet girl on Henry Avenue in Philadelphia, raised in a house where love was measured by what you had won that day, and who understood, before she could have put it into words, that silence was safer than any expression of feeling. That same silence carried her through a decade of Hollywood sound stages and gave her an Academy Award. It walked her down a ship's gangway in Monaco in 1956 and into a wedding watched by 30 million people, a wedding whose many of the crucial decisions had been made before she ever arrived. It carried her through palace kitchens, through poetry halls, through abandoned pictures, through her eldest daughter's failed marriage, through her younger daughter's open rebellion, and up the mountain road above the harbor that had once been beautiful and was, by the same evidence, suffocating. That silence never left her, because from the beginning it was not a performance. It was the one real continuous thread running under the entire length of her life, and it was the part of her the world could never see clearly, because she spent her whole life making sure that no one saw it. In April of 1956, when she stepped off that gangway into the morning light of Monaco, she believed she was walking toward a new life. What she was walking toward, the cameras of that morning could never show. And the woman who had spent her whole life learning to stay still under exactly that sort of intense scrutiny never told us either. Thank you very much for joining this investigation into the woman behind the most famous wedding dress of the 20th century. The question of what Grace Kelly actually thought about the life she performed is one that has divided serious biographers for decades, and it is a question every viewer brings a different answer to. We would love to hear yours in the comments. If you have an idea for the next subject we should investigate, please leave it in the suggestion box below. And if you have not yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next part of this series.